Okay, here we go. We're live. Perfect. So welcome everyone to Beyond the Comfort Zone, a show that helps you step out of your comfort zone into a place of growth and learning. For those of us who are joining us for the first time, I'm Aviva Wolmer, and I'm a Vistage Chair in Atlanta, Georgia. I lead two groups of incredibly driven and ambitious CEOs who want to accelerate toward their companies faster, as well as a group of growth-minded key executives who are driven to transform the companies that they work for. Our peer groups are a mastermind of CEOs or key executives who come together regularly to share ideas and experiences and support one another, knowing that together they will achieve more than they would on their own. No matter how many years of experience a leader has, the reality is that their knowledge and experiences are still limited. They don't know what they don't know because they haven't been exposed to it yet. A peer environment creates opportunities to see the unknown, be more proactive, and make better decisions. Today, I'm honored to have Nancy Capistran and Tara Goodwin, co-founders of Crisis Interception, as my guests. Crisis Interception is a company that leads decisive change in times of extreme adversity. Proactively, or when there is an actual crisis, they provide mental toughness, uncommon agility, sensitivity, professionalism, insight, and sound advice. Today, they're going to share with you what you can do proactively to prepare for when a crisis does come, because yes, you will have one, and the 911 of what to do when one hits. Welcome, Nancy and Tara. I'm so excited to have you both with us.
Thank you, Aviva. It's wonderful to be here. We appreciate it.
Thanks for having us.
For those joining us live, I'd love you to put your questions in the comments. We're going to monitor the comments in the chat today, and we'll try to get as many questions answered as possible. Before we start, I'd like to get to know our guests. Crises are thought of in different ways, so I'd love if you're live right now to put in chat one or two sentences that would be how you define crisis for a business. And with that, let's get started. So Crisis Interception, that's a very interesting and I'm sure intentional name. Is there a story behind it?
Nancy, do you want to start?
Sure. So, it's interesting because Tara and I have had experience working with people in professional athletes, and football was a big piece of it. And so when we thought about a name, we thought about when a football gets intercepted, it immediately takes the situation into a more favorable direction for the team. And we felt like that's what we do for crisis. We help to diffuse it as quickly as possible in the most meaningful way for the organization that we're working with.
Very interesting. I don't know much about football, but it makes a lot of sense. So crisis, I ask people to think about their definition of it, but how do you know when you're in crisis and what the difference between crisis and just an ordinary business interruption is?
Sure. So crises are prodromal, meaning that they're precursors of something that is yet to come. It could start out as a business interruption. So let's just say outside my office right now, a car hits a telephone pole, knocks out the entire internet to our building. I can't communicate with my clients for 2 hours, maybe up to 24 hours in my office. That's a business interruption. A full-blown crisis would be if that pole got knocked out and my entire server was fried and I couldn't access any of my files and I didn't have them uploaded to the cloud. That would be a full-blown crisis. Crises escalate in intensity. They fall under media or public or government scrutiny. They interfere with normal business operations, often for an extended period of time. They jeopardize the public opinion and good reputation that you've worked really hard to build up in your company. And they damage your bottom line if gone on for a long period of time.
Wow. Okay. Interesting way to think about it. Those are two good examples of the same incident, but creating different levels of intensity. How do you, or really, why is it? Because, crises obviously are very big and hugely impactful to a business. Why do you think CEOs avoid crisis planning? And maybe what should we do to be able to convince them that it's in their best interest to do so?
Yeah, I'd love to take that one. So there's a number of reasons, but oftentimes it really gets down to this one fact. Most CEOs and senior leaders are focusing on growth and profit and revenue. And when you're working to create a crisis plan and you're having to be proactive, that's more of a cost center versus a profit center. And so when there's something that's cost, they tend to think, oh, that's not going to happen to me. I'm not going to worry about that. But really, it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when and how severe a crisis happens. And when you are prepared, or at least have the foundational pieces that you need, you can respond much quicker. And that actually costs the company less, and you come out of the gate stronger right from the beginning.
So when a crisis happens, it will have less of an effect and from a monetary implication standpoint. But how do you convince a CEO to give up the immediate and urgent to deal with what could be the very important, but later?
Here's the reality of it, Aviva. CEOs usually come to us after they've had a crisis situation when it comes to planning. They will come to us to help us navigate through the crisis situation when their shorts are burning. However, when they want to plan, they usually will not do it until they've had a crisis and they felt that pain. And so what Nancy and I try to do is help them understand there's a way to avoid the pain altogether. And it's just a little bit of preparedness. And it's not rocket science, but you have to take the time to go through the steps to make sure that you are prepared.
What kind of time are we talking if you're being more proactive?
To develop a crisis plan, it would probably take maybe a day or two of downloading information and making sure that if we were working with a client, to make sure that we had all the information that we needed to prepare the plan. So one of the things that we do is we help them imagine worst case scenarios. So looking at their particular business, what are they most afraid of? Is it ransomware? Is it an active shooter? Is it a manufacturing accident? Is it a bus crash? Those are the kinds of things that we would look to develop scenarios for, so that when the worst case happens, they are prepared with holding statements. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. But to be honest, it probably takes a good 2 days of meeting with the staff, preparing the resources, and getting the materials that we need. And then we would help write the crisis plan for them.
Yeah, and I think in addition to that, it's really about, even if people can think about what are the worst case scenarios, where are the biggest risks in our particular company, because every company is different between the size and, whether it's a local company, an international company, a national, there's just so many variables to take into consideration. But if they can at least do a risk assessment to figure out what those bigger things are, and then trying to plan for what would be the first couple of steps that we need to put in place in order to be able to come out of the gate strong. We might still have to figure out some of it because the specifics are sometimes unknown until you're actually in that crisis. But having, the benchmark of what you need to do first is really mission critical.
Yeah, so I'm hearing it's not about preventing the crisis. What it is when the crisis happens, you've already got the first couple of action steps really taken care of, so you can focus on solving for it rather than the, oh my gosh, I don't know what's happening, what do I do moment.
Yeah,
exactly.
Because those are shocking moments. And oftentimes, if you think about the senior leadership team, they're already drinking from a fire hose, most of them, because of the day-to-day, the tactical and strategical stuff that they're doing, never mind adding a crisis into that. So how do you do business continuity and handle the crisis simultaneously? A lot of times puts executives kind of over the top because they're not experienced with how to handle a crisis. And so that's when we come in to try to help with the business continuity and the crisis, and helping them to prioritize what needs to be happening when, what can be done simultaneously, and just understanding that, that the kind of the project management style of how you do all of that is really mission critical. And the sooner if they have somebody on speed dial, they're going to get there much faster than if they're just starting from a blank sheet of paper.
Yeah, it's important to know when the moment happens what to do, and to have that plan already in place. So we're going to talk a lot about what some of these scenarios are and things, and how intense they are in a few minutes. I've got lots of questions for you on that, but I just want to put a plug here for those who are listening. While a day or two always sounds like a lot of time as a CEO or a key business leader, That's all it is compared to some of the things that you could be facing and what could happen if you don't do it, that we'll talk about a little bit later. So from that, next question really would be, what's the first thing you actually would do to prepare a company? What does that look like?
Well, we talked about having the crisis plan. That's really key. So if we're preparing a company, we would anticipate worst case scenarios. We would get all of their contact information together. We would make sure that they had a dedicated crisis team, and we're going to talk about that as well. Who should be on that team, what the team's functions are, and why that's so important. Because the last thing a CEO wants to do in a crisis is be alone and be making decisions unilaterally. It doesn't work. It's not going to be to the benefit of the company, and it's going to have repercussions. Having a team approach and having dedicated people on your staff that can easily get information back and forth from various divisions is key. So we would look at the crisis team. We'd look at other contact information that they need to have. For example, in a crisis, you might need to be able to communicate quickly. Do you need to have a call center? Do you need to have a dark website? And what that basically is a website that mimics yours, but when a crisis happens, you can activate it. And there's a 1-800 number, or you can put a statement. It allows people to see that you are responding to the crisis in real time. And all of these things can be done well in advance. It's really hard to play catch up when you're in an active crisis and try to save the situation as best you can. We've done it, we do it, but we prefer to have our clients prepared.
Yeah, the level of stress it's already going to be, beyond. But if you are prepared, then, it takes, just like anything, it takes time to get people coordinated and to figure out, but getting those diverse perspectives and doing it when calmer minds are prevailing, you're going to be more productive. So that proactive space is so much more beneficial for the outcome that could happen. And again, it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of where, when, and how severe.
Tell me more about crisis teams. Who's on them? How do you build them? What does that look like?
So every company, regardless of size, should have a crisis team. People will come to me and say, we're a 5-person company. And I'll say, I don't care. You can have one other person on your crisis team inside your company, and you might have a board of advisors, a board of directors. In Vistage, they have something called Tiger Teams. The Vistage members could act as a de facto crisis team. You need to have people that have experience, that can get information and can put together a strategic response plan right away. And what we usually do with our clients is we will make sure that they have the contact information of their crisis team at the ready. So we have electronic, it's in their phones. We also have old school, a laminated card that they carry with them that has everyone's phone number, their wife's name, their contact, their home phone, everything that they could possibly need to call up the SOS and convene a crisis team in times of peril. And it's, as far as positions, there are a few that I think are important. So it would be division heads, depending on when there's a crisis. For example, I represent a manufacturing company, and they have a variety of different divisions. Those division heads are part of the overall larger crisis team and are on call. If there's a crisis in a particular division, then that manager would be responsible for being part of the team with the executive managers in that particular situation. There are attorneys. Some companies have in-house attorneys, other companies have outsourced attorneys. That's very important because legally you want to make sure you're in the bounds of what you're allowed to say to not cause further damage to the company. Also a communications professional, a PR professional. They will talk with the lawyers, and we always work strategically with lawyers for a number of different reasons. But one of them is to make sure that we have a statement that we can get out right away that works in both camps. So PR people sometimes are accused of wanting to say too much and over communicate, while lawyers are on the other end of that spectrum and would advise the client to say nothing. But saying nothing in a crisis is not the right response because it implies indifference or worse, even guilt. Nancy, do you want to talk about some of the other positions on the crisis team?
Yeah, thanks, Tara. So I would say it's important, obviously, to have a crisis manager, somebody who is overarching that and is working and connecting and regularly having dialogue with the executive team, and potentially even the board. But also, it's important to have somebody from HR, because any kind of a crisis is impacting the employees, and we want to make sure that they understand what's going on and that they can respond appropriately as they need to. Also, having somebody in the finance department is important because there's always going to be a spend associated, and it's often, it's not something that's traditionally budgeted. So trying to get that kind of stuff happening, and even if it's a mid-market company, that, having somebody in the purchasing department to get, the POs out there and be able to get outsourced information. It could be that you need somebody who can get out, whether you do a hard copy and you mail something to people that are impacted. I mean, there's so many variables based on the situations that you need to have at the ready. It's really important. And to Tara's point, having an attorney, already ahead of time, that's an important one. Somebody that understands crisis, that's a business attorney that can provide sound counsel is very important. Somebody in safety or security, things like that are also important depending on the dynamics of any particular company and the crisis, the high risk things that could potentially happen for them. IT, if there's a data breach or if there's a product recall, who do you have? Who do you call? Those are some of the other variables that I think are important to be thinking about when you think about your organization or your client. If you're a trusted advisor and for a client and they have a crisis, what might be some advice that you can provide? Those are some things that I think are really important.
And Aviva, there's also one more person that doesn't get talked about often, but I encourage clients to consider. It's a person who does his or her job wonderfully. You have a lot of respect for them, but they also irritate you and make your blood boil. Why do I say this? Because it is always important to have a different point of view from yours. And sometimes when you're in a crisis, a lot of people will be drinking the CEO Kool-Aid. Oh my God, Aviva, that is the best decision. Let's go forward. But they're not digging deeply. This particular person might put up the flag and say, you know what, you are absolutely going to crash and burn if you do that. And here's why. Now, you may not take that person's advice, but that person should be considered on your crisis team for that reason.
Yeah, and I'd love to add to that too, is I think, when any of these areas of business that we've talked about, whether it's HR or legal or finance or division heads, I mean, it needs to be people that are very good they're the best in their space, because you need to have all of those minds kind of talking about how it's impacting various areas within the organization to be able to get the best possible outcomes. If you have a missing space that doesn't have a voice in that conversation, you could really miss some critical things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that makes a lot of sense. You need a lot of diversity of thought at that time.
Yeah.
I particularly like your suggestion to have the antagonist in the room. It's not something you typically would think about, but it makes a lot of sense. Because you need to make sure you have all kinds of perspectives, because the CEO or whoever's leading the team may not be the one who actually knows the most in the scenario, or the right person to make the decisions and the calls.
Very true.
Oh, very interesting. And you mentioned something before, Tara, about it's not a good idea to not respond and not answer, despite the fact that lawyers commonly say that. Can you tell me, like, when something starts out, for example, digitally on social media out there, someone tweets something that shouldn't be tweeted. We all know those circumstances. How do you know what to respond and when to respond?
So there's a 4-question test that I have learned through advanced crisis management courses and my own practice here. But one of the things that you start with before you even ask yourself 4 questions about whether to respond or not is, what would reasonable people expect a responsible company to do in this situation? It is an extremely easy question to ask, but it's one that's never asked in boardrooms. They're all trying to think about, I've got to protect my company, but they're not thinking about the stakeholders, the people that are actually looking in from the outside. So that is the question that you should ask yourself in terms of when you are faced with a situation, whether or not you should respond. And if you feel like a response is imminent, what would a reasonable response be? And you'd be surprised what comes out of that if you ask yourself that question.
That's a great question. I feel like in so many circumstances, not just in crisis, but when you're trying to figure out how to communicate effectively to your team or to your company. I know a lot of leaders who struggle with, what do I say in this circumstance to roll something out even that's a positive thing. I like that question. I think it can be applied in a lot of ways.
And we'll talk about that too in the holding statement section. Nancy, did you want to add something?
Yeah, I just thought it was interesting. So one of the things that's a differentiator with how Tara and I approach things is we often collaborate with the attorneys so that it's actually best protecting the client. And, there's attorney-client privileges by us doing it in that fashion, but it allows for us to talk with the crisis team and also with the attorney so that we're all on the same page and understanding what it is. And sometimes it's, oftentimes it's not a lengthy communication. It's really every single word choice is mission critical because people can change their view of what that says. So we have to be very intentional that it's clear and, precise with what we're trying to be effective in, and making sure that we're all, kind of looking at, all right, this might be the first communication, but as we're seeing this travel and some of the experiences that we've had, we want to make sure, like, some people may want to say certain things and we might pull that back saying, look, we don't have a crystal ball. We don't know what's going to happen next, but we've seen these other things happen. So limiting what we're saying and being intentional about just using these word choices is mission critical in how this lays out and how it unfolds.
Mm-hmm.
And it all falls under the same umbrella. What is the one thing that the public, that stakeholders, that employees want from a company in crisis? What is it? They want to know that the company cares about the situation, about what's happening. That's the underlying premise of all of this. And if you can demonstrate throughout your response that you care deeply about what's going on, not just reading a statement, standing up at a podium, being very wooden, but showing that you truly care about this crisis situation, you will succeed in navigating through it. And one of the things that you had asked, Aviva, is, what do we respond? How do we respond? Should we respond? And that's a question that I get a lot because sometimes, as you had mentioned, things start out on social media and then they escalate and snowball. So through some of my studies, there's a crisis protocol that's a 4-question test. And I think it's brilliant. It wasn't mine, but I certainly use it. 1, will those who matter expect us to say or do something right now? So that's the first question.
Okay.
The second is, if we're silent, will it be seen as being indifferent or worse, guilt, culpability? 3, are other people identifying this crisis for us? I mean, look at this. We have iPhones, citizen journalists who are at the ready. I had a CEO learn of a fire in his tissue paper plant, one of his branches, on Facebook. An employee didn't call the fire department. They put it on Facebook first before the fire department was called. True story.
Wow.
Crazy. So are others shaping the perception of my company and I'm not doing anything about it? And then the last one is, if we wait and don't respond, will we lose the ability to affect the outcome? And if you answer yes to any one of those 4 questions, act now. So it's pretty straightforward and quite simple when you break it down.
I think the high quality diligence is also a key component. They want to know that you're actively working on fixing the problem in the best way possible. And sometimes haste makes waste. And so that's why it's important to have the right minds in the room to be able to talk through it in an expeditious fashion, to be able to take the action necessary.
So I'm curious, because I imagine that you mostly get called in when it's 911, not to be proactive. What % of your business is proactively helping clients versus handling the actual crises?
Sadly, less than 10%, Aviva. And we try to change that. We have developed materials. We have a proprietary crisis planning guidebook that takes people through. They can do it themselves, so they don't have to pay us to do it. We spent a lot of time and effort into it. And the bottom line is, they don't want to do it until they've experienced a crisis. And that's unfortunate. But it's
a guidebook on your... Sorry.
They think it's not going to happen to them. And that's why they just say, that's not going to happen to me. That'll happen to the other person. And it does.
And that is reality. Until it happens to you, it's not happened to you. So is that guidebook you mentioned on your website?
We use it now as a planning tool. We redesigned our website because we noticed that there wasn't a huge demand for it, but it is still available and we do sell it for clients.
Yeah, so they can reach out to us and we'll be happy to work with them on it.
Perfect. Just want to make sure people know what resources are available to them. So I asked that question because what strikes me as you're talking, and if only 10% are planning ahead, there's a whole lot of people that aren't. How often do you get on the scene after someone's already responded in a way they shouldn't have and typed that answer out on social that shouldn't have been out there, and you're cleaning up a mess?
There are a few times that we've done that, but fortunately, most of our clients and the calls come from the attorney. So the attorney will call us and he or she has already advised the client not to say anything until you talk to the crisis pros. So we've been fortunate that that has happened. We have had clients who have made some gaffes on social media that we've been able to work with and repair and kind of pull it back a little bit. But unfortunately, social media lasts forever, as you know, as you've seen. So you have to be very careful and very intentional. You know, years and years and years ago, when I was in college at Boston University, I had a professor of journalism by the name of Doug Crockett. He's a late Boston Globe reporter. And he said, never write anything that you wouldn't want to see on the front page of the Boston Globe if it goes bad. And I've always remembered that even before I started Crisis. And that's the key. Sometimes people think that they're being funny and flip, and there's a way to do it. And it has been done very beautifully by some companies and client, advertising agencies, but you have to be very careful, especially in this day and age.
Yeah, I just imagine how many, you're right, at least attorneys typically will tell you to be quiet until there's a better bit of advice in, but I imagine since people don't think will happen to them, they don't have someone on speed dial to come in, they react and respond because they feel like they must, and then find out that the way they responded was probably not very smart to begin with. So if anything, everybody today who's watching this, you have someone that I'll make sure his contact info is at the bottom. So if something happens, don't speak and dial someone that can help you with a crisis.
Yes, and I would say, go ahead.
Sorry. I was going to say, and most important, the public has an amazing capacity to forgive, but you have to ask for it. There's no place for arrogance in our society. People will immediately turn off. You need to be transparent. You need to be honest. You need to be extremely sorry for what has happened or what is going on. And if you don't demonstrate that, then you're going to lose right out of the gate, no matter what you say.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and the word choices there to be able to communicate that are very important. One of the things I think you talked about earlier, Aviva, and I just wanted to put a little bit more information out there, is when something's happening, you first find out that something's happening, there's certain things that you need to be asking yourself: who, what, when, where, how, and why. Any of the answers that you can get, and that's going to be evolving because it's a living, moving situation, but getting as many of those facts, again, not hearsay, facts, is mission critical to making the best decisions as you go through the crisis process.
And we have a PDF of that, I believe, Aviva, that you can give to anyone who's interested. It's key questions to ask your team in a crisis.
Yes, I do have that, and I'll be sending it out to viewers of this or anybody who has this at the end. So
great.
Thank you. It's great that you're providing some tools to my guests today. I really appreciate it. You mentioned communication. And when I think of communication, I see it being so multifaceted, right? There's communication to employees, there's potentially a board of directors, there's customers or clients, there's the public. How do you know who to communicate to, and what are you communicating the same thing to all stakeholders? Is it different? Walk us through that a little bit, please.
Sure. It really depends on the situation, but most communications are very similar. They may have some modifications depending on the audience. For example, we had a crisis that was entirely internal. It did not get into the court of public opinion, as I say, out in the public on social media or reported by journalists, but it was a blow to employees about what was happening. And it was, learning someone within their organization was not the person that they thought that he happened to be. So we had to write communications for the CEO and for the senior managers to talk about it, but it had to be in a way that was authentic. So we had key points that they had to hit, but we also wanted them to be themselves in that conversation. So that's very different than putting together a statement for the media, which has a number of different points that you have to consider. But they're all rooted in the same 5 elements. So the first thing that you have to do when you're preparing a communication statement is to acknowledge that it happened, that the CEO or that the leaders are aware of what's been going on, or you're informing someone of what happened. And then you want to make sure that you have empathy for any victims, anyone who has been wronged by this crisis. You also want to talk about the values of your company. What are the values that are informing your decision today and what you're going to do? So at our company, we take pride in XYZ, and that can tie back to your company's why, your DNA, because that's important communicating as a company. And then people want to know, what are you going to do about this crisis? So what is your approach? How are you going to handle it and when? And then the last piece of it is, what commitment can you make right now? And what can you expect from us? So in a major crisis, for example, you can say, we're going to be having press conferences at 2, 5, and 7. And you better make sure that at 2 p.m., 5 p.m., and 7 p.m., you're out there updating people. But it could be something as easy as, we're conducting an internal investigation, and as soon as those results are available, we will have them to you within 14 days.
We're talking.
Oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead. I'll answer my question.
Okay. So the consistency in that message is really important. It may need to be tweaked based on the stakeholders, and it's important to understand and really have an intentional conversation into who are all the stakeholders, internally and externally. Because one snafu that we've seen is people not really having a complete list of who those stakeholders are, whether it's your board. I mean, there's so many internal and external, your customers, it could be clients, whatever those things are, your employees, but sometimes they just forget to include a really mission critical stakeholder. And then there's a lot of damage control that has to be done with that. So
why wasn't I informed? That's a big one, Nancy.
Yes.
So thinking that's actually is, a really good point from a preparation standpoint too, because in the moment, it's so hard to think of everyone for everything that needs to happen. But if you've got a list in advance, then that's a really easy thing to do. So one potential action item is just think of who you would need to communicate to in those moments so that you have that list nearby when one does occur. One of the things that strikes me, we're talking in, a lot of the crises is not that we've really described too many, but are very public in nature. But I would imagine that there's a lot of businesses out there, maybe smaller, mid-sized businesses, that their crisis isn't something that would end up in the public news or the public eye, but it's still very much a crisis for them. They have to deal with customers, they have to deal with suppliers on a different scale. What's different, if anything, about those?
The exact same communications tools and outreach applies. It's not different. And it's funny because as a Vistage speaker, I go around the country and speak to CEOs. And when I do an overview, I give a lot of national crisis and show videos of the reported crisis and how they were not handled properly. And CEOs will say to me, well, that's not impacting my business. I said, oh, yes, it is. You happen to have this particular newspaper, this particular television station. If something goes wrong, if an employee starts talking to the media about something that you know nothing about, you're going to be on the hot seat faster than you can imagine. And they realize that the same principles apply, and you have to make sure that you're communicating in an effective way. And if you don't, even if you're a small company, it's not going to be swept under the rug, and you're going to have a lot more damage control to have to do.
Very
interesting.
interesting.
I think there's another piece of it too. It depends on what's actually happening in our world, because the news reports on a lot of different things, and if it's a slow news cycle, then things that might not get percolated into the public end up doing that. And other times, if there's, a lot of big things that are happening, then it may not be in the news. So there's just so many different variables, and many are outside of the control of any of us. It's planning appropriately for whatever happens in those regards, and having something in your back pocket for a statement is one of the most important things.
So bad assumption on my part that probably a lot of the people I work with, businesses, wouldn't end up on the news. It's very possible from the things you've experienced and seen.
And even if it's not the news, Aviva, you can damage your employee base. And all of a sudden people, we're living in a world right now of quiet quitting. Employees do have the upper hand. They want to choose where they work. And if something damages their vision of the company and its trajectory and their excitement to work there, they can lose their workforce as a result. So it's not just a crisis that hits the media. It can be completely internal and very damaging.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, it's interesting to think about because, I ran a business too, and I think I'd be in the same boat of not thinking any of that would ever really happen to me. So I'm sitting here running through how would I have responded in my previous roles, leading companies to things like this, into this conversation.
We actually had a client that said it's, they weren't really worried that it was going to get into the paper, this particular situation. And it blew up on social media in a very meaningful way. And people were like guilty just because of what was being communicated on social media. And this individual who was communicating was just like spreading it everywhere. And it wasn't based on facts. And so we ended up having to do a social media campaign and a lot of other behind the scenes things to be able to diffuse that situation. But once it's out there, it's out there. And that, Tara, I don't know if you want to add to that situation of what we ended up doing and how that all, but they thought they were okay. And it turned out, boom, just the opposite.
And it's a knee-jerk reaction too. If someone has, this started out as a consumer complaint, basically. Is that the one you're talking about? Okay, I just want to make sure because we navigate a lot of crises. It started out as a consumer complaint, and this particular person who was making the complaint had a blog and had over, 1,500 followers, something like that. And so disparaging somebody else, talking about a bad experience, magnified. And what is the reaction? What is the public reaction to this? And it's almost embarrassing to say this, but the reaction wasn't, oh, well, that can't be true. I've been there for years. I know this company. I know their employees. It was a knee-jerk reaction, as Nancy said, guilty. Oh my God, that's horrible. And automatically just believed what they wrote on a blog. And it turned out it wasn't true. We worked in partnership with the legal team. She actually removed her post, apologized, her husband apologized, but damage was done. Because it went beyond her. Like she might have had 1,500 people, which you don't think is a lot, but in a community,
they just kind of went and passed it on and posted it on theirs. And so it just has, a web of just, where it went.
And the sad thing, Aviva, none of it was true. None of it was true. And that's the unfortunate thing, because you can see lives and reputations that you have worked a lifetime to build destroyed in seconds. And we've seen it. It makes us sick to our stomach. And we want to make sure nobody else has to go through some of the things that we've helped navigate.
That's very unfortunate.
Yeah. And I think that's why we're so positive and outspoken about pre-planning, because it happens so fast, and you just like the rug gets pulled up around you and you got to respond.
How many various crises do you think you handle in a year?
I don't know that we can share some of the ones that we've had. I mean, some big ones were the multi-billion-dollar international organization that had products catching on fire around the world. We've had data breaches that employee information and healthcare information stolen internationally from a company and get out there. We've had CFOs stealing from companies. We've had the managing partner of even a law firm that's very healthy had his annual checkup that day, fell asleep, never woke up because he had a brain aneurysm, and all of the intellectual property that was in his head and for managing the firm died with him. You know, we've had somebody who was leaving a Celtics game and they were driving home and had a massive heart attack, crashed and died at that moment. And so, you know, they were in the middle of a major acquisition. And so it is just so many different ones. And I'm sure Tara can share many more, but that's just kind of the variety of different things. Rogue employees, harassment.
Celebrity, we've had celebrity lawsuits against other celebrities that they work with. We've had damage to a potential celebrity's brand from another celebrity that was associated with that brand, and how you handle that. We've had data breaches, which have been horrible, ransomware, knocking a complete manufacturing company out for several weeks and having to go back and do old school orders with a pen and a paper and a file cabinet. So there have been many different crisis situations, and it really depends. I think probably anywhere from 30 to 50 a year, Nancy, probably, depending on the calls that we get. And some of them
vary, right?
They do. Some of them can be handled very, very quickly, fortunately, and the fire can be put out, and others are more long-term. And very few of them are planning calls again. And that's the thing that we really want to try to stress here, that with a little bit of planning, and as we said, 2 days, it seems like it's, oh my God, I'm going to be offline for, part of a week. Well, yes, but it could save you hundreds, thousands, if not millions of dollars. And if we just have a moment, I'm just going to illustrate really quickly. One of our clients many, many years ago was the largest fire truck manufacturer on the East Coast. And they sell fire trucks all over New England. A fire truck in the city of Boston lost its brakes in 2019, and it killed Lieutenant Kevin Kelly of the Boston, 2009, sorry, killed Lieutenant Kevin Kelly of the Boston Fire Department, slammed into a building. I got the call on a Saturday from the CEO. I said, let's call together your team. He didn't have a crisis plan. He didn't have a crisis team, but he knew that we handled crisis. So we started talking and fact finding, asking those key questions. What happened? So the fire chief, in the interim while we were doing this, went on television and said that the fire truck was last serviced at Greenwood Emergency Vehicles, the name of the company. So all of a sudden the spotlight came right on to Greenwood. And it was true that the vehicle was last serviced there, but there was a very important qualifier. Greenwood Emergency Vehicles only focused on the firefighting components, the ladders, the hoses, the pumpers, the foam, nothing to do with the brakes. The brakes were contracted out with the city of Boston. It was part of the city's fire department's mechanical contract. So I said to the CEO, we have to get on, out there right away with a statement. And I wanted to do a press conference because the attention, as you can imagine, when a firefighter is killed, it was a horrible, horrible situation. It was reported very, very widely. And he didn't want to do that because it was a weekend. So I realized he hadn't been media trained. He was not very media savvy. So I said, all right, we're going to write a statement and we're going to start calling all of the outlets and you're going to do interviews. And I want you to just stick to the statement. So we talked about the fact that Greenwood, this is a tragedy. Greenwood, only services the firefighting components of the vehicle. And he did very well. And I was on instant messaging with him until he got to the Associated Press, which was a very large outlet. And he said at the end, the reporter said to him, boy, Tim, this was a terrible tragedy. And he said, yes, it really was. I only wish we had caught it. And at that moment, I froze and my fingers started typing. And I said, you wouldn't have caught it. You weren't looking for it because Greenwood only services the firefighting components of the vehicle sent. He rallied. He actually got that statement out. The news cycle story had 2 days in the media mentioning Greenwood, mentioning the fact it only services the firefighting components. And several years later, the family of Kevin Kelly sued 5 companies for wrongful death. Greenwood was not among them. The client called me and said, you just saved me millions of dollars for a very short amount of money. And I said, you're welcome. And that's how it works. And that's why we stress, be prepared. And be prepared to act as soon as possible.
Oh, yeah. You just think about all those aspects of that you would never really think of. I mean, it's interesting going through that whole scenario of everything, even to the instant message you sent saying, whoa, that was incorrect statement, because he probably would have been part of the lawsuit.
Well, I was scared to be able to put him up with reporters anyway, so that's why I deferred to the instant messaging. But I'm telling you, Aviva, my fingers were flying over that keyboard, and I felt the sweat actually trickling down my back, because I thought this could be really, really bad if he took responsibility for something that really wasn't his problem.
Mm-hmm.
And that's when we get back to word choice is so important, because he didn't think that there was anything wrong with it. And we're like, yikes, wait. Change that quick. So that's the piece of it. That's where we bring, that knowledge of, is this the right word? And Tara and I think we spend a lot of time quickly, but just kind of thinking about, all right, what about this word? Does this make sense? Maybe this is a better word. And it seems like it's, very micro in doing that. But there is, one word that makes a difference, and that's what happened in her example.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm going to shift gears because you've mentioned this phrase a couple of times, and since I don't know what it is, I know that my viewers don't know what it is. Can you tell me what a holding statement is?
So a holding statement is pretty much what I went through when we were talking about how to respond, acknowledge, empathy, what are the values that inform that's the anatomy of a holding statement. But a holding statement is a statement that allows a company to respond in a crisis, to get out fast, to get out first with the information they have at that particular time, so that it's not identified by anybody else and they are communicating that they own that crisis.
Okay.
If they wait for citizen journalists, or they wait for the media to start asking questions and reporting about it, you're losing traction. So taking command, a holding statement enables a company to take command of a crisis as it happens. Now, you probably will have to go back and add to that, because crisis unfolds over time. It can unfold in a day, it can unfold in a couple of weeks. So you have to be able to be responsive to it, but it puts your stake in the ground that you are out there and you are communicating with your stakeholders.
And it's usually a couple of sentences or so, just to kind of talk about the basics, and really, again, that ownership, like, yeah, we got it, we're working on it. And then you evolve as it happens. But each type of crisis would require a different type of statement. So it's very important to be thinking about, who's this message going to, who are those stakeholders, and how do we most effectively have consistent messaging through all stakeholders that we're interacting with.
But they all have the same basic formula, which is that acknowledge what happened, express empathy, talk about your corporate values, what are you going to do to fix it, and what commitments can you make? So they all have that basic, those 5 elements in it at some point or another. But it's very important. And when CEOs go out and they're arrogant, or, I've heard so many different excuses. The public did not understand what we were doing. I've heard some phrases and I just bristle, and I'm thinking, oh, wow, how are they getting counseled to say that? Because your public, your stakeholders are the most important people in your organization besides your employees. It's why you exist. And not communicating and taking a point that you are upset, and I can understand how it happens, but it's just unfortunate when you see it, because with social media, they are just skewered when that happens.
Yeah. I think there's another piece of that too, is that, we work with, when bad things happen to good intentioned people. Once we had a client that chose not to listen to us, and we kept saying, no, really, and we're telling you, this is what's going to happen. And there was so much ego between these two partners that they just kept waiting. And then, you know what, in all honesty, they lost their business, and they were living large, let's just say, and they lost it because they didn't take it seriously. They didn't listen to our counsel, and it was unfortunate. And they called us back and like, we're days away from, everything being shut down. And we're like, but we've told you several times, well, what can we do now? And it's like, kind of the bus has already left the station at that point. And
write a book about your experience, and don't let it happen to anybody else.
Yeah.
Well, I appreciate all the examples and the stories. I think it's really helpful for people to understand and grasp what crises could even happen to them and what could come. I'm curious, if I pinned you each down on this one, what is one piece of advice you would want to leave with my viewers? So Nancy, we'll start with you.
Please pre-plan, please.
Okay. Tara, you can't use the same piece of advice, so give me another one.
And if you absolutely can't pre-plan, this is 1.5, I'm sorry, form a crisis team and think about your worst case scenarios and how to respond. It'll put you in better stead than not having any plan.
So if you can't fully pre-plan, still pre-plan, just parts of it.
Just part way, part way.
We've seen the ugliness of when people don't, and that's why we're just trying to make it as easy as possible. And we do have a couple of, one sheet things that might be helpful if people are, interested in getting a little bit more of that information that we'd offer for free to try to help them to at least start those conversations.
Well, I appreciate that. I will say, Nancy and Tara have given me a couple of those, so I will put those out to anybody who is viewing this so that you have access to those materials as well. So if you can't fully pre-plan, at least do a little bit of pre-planning with the tools they're providing. Thank you so much for graciously providing those. Also, I know that Nancy and Tara are available if you have questions about what it might be, what it might look like to pre-plan, just to have a, conversation here or there. Am I right about that?
Absolutely.
So their contact info I'll be putting in chat in just a minute so that you can reach out to them if you just want to pick their brains a little bit or know who they are for a bigger engagement. Hopefully you're not in a crisis right now and need them right now. I always ask all of my viewers a kind of fun ending question. This is beyond the comfort zone. So we're helping my members and viewers get out of their comfort zone today. But what is one thing that you haven't done yet that's outside your comfort zone that you would like to try or kind of be pushed to stretch yourself? So who wants to go first?
I will start. So I have 2 sons. One is 33 and one is 21. And they have consistently asked me to go skydiving with them. And it terrifies me, but it also excites me. So I am definitely going to try to do that in the near future.
It is a lot of fun. You will enjoy it. It's not as scary as you think it is. And Nancy, what about you?
I think I push myself a lot outside my comfort zone, and I've done a lot of very adventurous things. But one thing I haven't done is I want to do like whitewater rafting in, pretty intense water. So it would be, it wouldn't be a mellow whitewater rafting. It would be a very challenging one. I think that would be fun to do.
Well, you can come visit down here. There's some really good ones for that.
Nice. Great to know. Thank you.
I think we have to be adrenaline junkies to be in this profession anyway. So
yeah,
I was going to say, I'm getting some pretty adrenaline answers, and I must be one with my show being called Beyond the Comfort Zone and saying, yes, I've skydived, and yes, I've done the whitewater rafting. So
there you go.
There you go. Well, good. Thank you guys for joining me today. And thank you to all my viewers. It is truly an honor that I had you guys as a guest on my show today. And until next time on Beyond the Comfort Zone, I encourage all of my viewers to try something new outside of your comfort zone, because that's where growth occurs and life begins. Have a great day, everyone.